Uh, where did Steve go? Oh, there he is. Oh, yeah, handout, right, yeah. But I was thinking about the other Steve. There he is. Oh, okay, right, right. Well, thanks very much, Steve. It's a little embarrassing to be sit there right in front of you and be talked about in that fashion. And also unduly glowing terms. It reminds me of a story told once by, now I can't think of his name. That's one of the problems with being over 80. I can't think of his name. But in any event, he said he was introduced in a fashion he thought was a bit over the top, and he said in response, he said, when I get introduced in this way, I have to pray God to forgive the introducer for stretching the truth and to forgive me for enjoying it so much. So I'm delighted to be here. Oh, I should also say I also remember with pleasure those Wheaton meetings those many years ago when all of us Calvin philosophers were smokers. We'd have to race off campus every hour to go smoke in our cars because smoking wasn't allowed on the campus. But, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted with this particular topic of this meeting of the Society of Christian Philosophers, namely the nature of Christian philosophy, which is a topic of great interest to me and one that I'm very seriously interested in. It's a pleasure, therefore, to be here. When Steve Lake called me and asked me to come and talk at this meeting, I told him that I really didn't have anything new to say. I've said everything, just about everything I've got to say I've already said. And maybe some of these things I've said several times. But I did offer to give a sort of lightly edited version of my paper, Augustinian Christian Philosophy, which I wrote many years ago, 20 years ago. It was published 20 years ago, and so I figured anybody who had read it would probably have forgotten it by now, so it might be appropriate anyway. Now, the topic here is Christian philosophy, and this morning, Bruce Benson mentioned Heidegger. Heidegger did not take a very high view of Christian philosophy. Heidegger said Christian philosophy was a square circle. I suppose that's sort of typical continental philosophy way of saying something like, it's impossible. Christian philosophy is a square circle. Why is it a square circle? Well, because if you're a Christian philosopher, you have to sacrifice the autonomy of your reason to something else, to faith or who knows what exactly. But anyway, you have to sacrifice the autonomy of your reason. And Heidegger thought that was a bad idea. Heidegger in general was very big on autonomy. At least if my late friend Richard Rorty is to be believed, Heidegger once said that he felt guilty existing in a universe that he had not himself created, which I thought, I mean, that sort of, after that I didn't have quite as much confidence in Heidegger's judgment. So that's Heidegger's idea, but I think Heidegger is wrong, and there really is such a thing as Christian philosophy. And this Augustinian Christian philosophy paper, I try to say something about how it should go. I do realize, of course, that there are two sides to the Christian philosopher's position or task, an outward-looking one and an inward-looking one. This paper is about the inward-looking one. So, Augustinian Christian philosophy. How does Christianity bear on philosophy? Is there such a thing as Christian philosophy, or are there only Christians who are also philosophers? How should Christianity and philosophy be related? Should they be related? The right way to think about this matter, so it seems to me, is broadly Augustinian. So I want to propose a programmatic sketch, a very programmatic sketch of a conception of Christian philosophy that grows out of some central Augustinian emphases. I don't claim, however, that Augustine, in fact, thought of Christian philosophy exactly the way I'm suggesting. The primary focus of my talk is not really historical. In any event, that would be beyond my competence. What I want to do is to make a suggestion as to how we should think about Christian philosophy now. But this way of thinking about it grows out of Augustinian roots. It's worth noting, furthermore, that what's at issue here is not just a way of thinking about Christianity and philosophy, but also Christianity and scholarship more generally. So if you've got a copy of this handout, as I say, there are 4 elements to Augustinian Christian philosophy, at least 4, possibly more, but at least these 4. And the first 2 of these, so it seems to me, are widely recognized and relatively uncontroversial. So I'll be very brief about them. The remaining 2, however, require more by way of explanation, illustration, and defense. So first, philosophical theology. Clearly, one thing that goes into Christian philosophy, thought of in an Augustinian fashion, is philosophical theology. Or you could call it theological philosophy, doesn't matter which. Philosophical theology is a matter of thinking about the central doctrines of the Christian faith from a philosophical perspective and employing the resources of philosophy. At present, this enterprise is faring well, perhaps even flourishing, so I'll say no more about it. Secondly, there's apologetics. Apologetics, from an Augustinian perspective, comes in 2 varieties. First of all, there is negative apologetics, where the aim is to defend Christianity against attack from its various detractors. The attacks in question may take various forms. I won't list them because I think everybody here is already familiar with them. I do want to note one, however. One of the most interesting is, this is with apologies to those who really like Nietzsche, is Nietzsche's nuanced and balanced suggestion that indulgence in Christianity promotes and encourages a weak, sniveling, inferior, hypocritical, dishonest, and generally disgusting sort of person. People perhaps like Mother Teresa, or perhaps the present Pope. So there's negative apologetics, but there's also positive apologetics. And here the intended audience, at least in paradigm cases, is those who are outside the faith, together with those who are looking, together with the unbelieving aspect in every believer. I would say Richard Swinburne is certainly the outstanding current positive apologete. Philosophical theology and apologetics are relatively uncontroversial, and both have been prospering. There are 2 other important elements of Augustinian Christian philosophy, however, that haven't been doing as well. These 2 elements, you might think, are more specifically Augustinian. I call the first of these Christian philosophical criticism, but only because I can't think of a better name. So, Christian philosophical criticism. According to Augustine, human history is the arena of a struggle, a battle, or a contest between 2 profoundly opposed forces. Augustine spoke of the city of God and the earthly city, or the city of the world, the civitas Dei and the civitas mundi. The former is dedicated in principle to God and to the fulfillment of his will and to the accomplishment of his purposes. The second has a very different focus. Augustine, I believe, is dead right. The contemporary Western intellectual world, like Augustine's world, is a sort of arena in which there rages a battle for people's souls. This battle, I believe, is a 3-way contest, and I want to try to characterize the contestants. Of course, an undertaking like this is at best fraught with peril, and at worst arrogantly presumptuous. The intellectual culture of the contemporary Western world is vast and amorphous and far-flung, including a stunning variety of ways of thinking and an enormous variety of intellectual traditions that are never found in pure form, but influence and interpenetrate one another in 1,000 complex ways. We know how hard it is to get a real sense of the intellectual climate of a past era, the Enlightenment, let's say, or 13th century Europe, or 19th century America. it is clearly much more difficult to come to a solid understanding of one's own time. Real trepidation is very much in order. But why should that stop us? So, as I see it, there are at present, and at bottom, three main competitors vying for spiritual supremacy in the West. I don't know that much about the rest of the world, but in America and Europe. Three fundamental perspectives or ways of looking, ways of thinking about what the world is like and what we ourselves are like and what is most important about the world, what our place in it is, and what we must do to live the good life. The first of these perspectives is Christianity or Christian theism. I'll say very little about that. I do want to remind you, however, that despite recent modest successes in various parts of the world, and I would say in philosophy over the last 50 years, in the United States anyway, the Christian perspective has been very much on the defensive, at least in the West, ever since the Enlightenment. In addition to the Christian perspective, there are fundamentally two others. Both of these other pictures have been with us since the ancient world, but each has received more powerful expression in modern times. According to the first perspective, there is no God, nor anything else beyond nature, and we human beings are insignificant parts of a vast cosmic machine that proceeds in majestic indifference to us, to our hopes and aspirations, our needs and our desires, our sense of fairness and fittingness. This picture goes back to Epicurus, Democritus, and others in the ancient world, and finds eloquent expression in Lucretius' poem De Rerum Natura. Let's call this perennial naturalism. According to the second perspective, on the other hand, it is we ourselves, we human beings, who are responsible for the basic structure of the world. This notion goes back to Protagoras in the ancient world, with its claim that man is the measure of all things. It finds enormously more powerful expression in Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. We could call this perspective Enlightenment humanism or Enlightenment subjectivism, but perhaps a better name is creative anti-realism. Perennial naturalism and creative anti-realism are very different. I shall say something about each. I'm warming up to my subject. So first, perennial naturalism. Among contemporary or near contemporary exponents of perennial naturalism are Bertrand Russell, John Dewey, Willard Van Orman Quine, Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett. Perhaps the majority of contemporary Anglo-American philosophers. I've read somewhere that some 60% of American philosophers are naturalists. A surprising number of liberal theologians, and a host of others in and out of academia. From this perspective, there is no God, and human beings are properly seen as part of nature. The way to understand what's most distinctive about us, our ability to love, to act, to think, to use language, our humor and play acting, our art, philosophy, literature, history, our morality, our religion. The fundamental way to understand all of this is in terms of our community with non-human nature. We are best seen as parts of nature and are to be understood in terms of our place in the natural world. The form this perspective takes in our day is broadly evolutionary. We are to try to understand human phenomena by way of their origin in random genetic mutation or some other source of variability, and their perpetuation by natural selection. Consider sociobiological explanations of love, for example. Love between men and women, between parents and children, love for one's friends, love of church, college, country, love in all its various manifestations and infinite variety. Taken thus broadly, love is an extremely important force in human lives. And how are we to think of love on the sort of evolutionary account in question? Well, the basic idea is that love arose ultimately and originally by way of some source of variability such as random genetic mutation. It persisted via natural selection because it has or had survival value. Male and female human beings, like male and female hippopotami, get together to have children, or colts, stay together to raise them, and this has survival value. Once we see that point, we understand that sort of love and see its basic significance. And the same goes for these other varieties and manifestations of love. And that, fundamentally, is what there is to say about love. Perennial naturalism is particularly popular among those who take a high view of modern science. It also sometimes influences, and as I see it, sometimes corrupts Christian thinking. Christians who think about science, for example, sometimes say that science can't take any account of God in giving its explanations. Science is necessarily restricted both in its subject matter and in its explanations and accounts to the natural world. But why think a thing like that? Of course, the claim might be merely verbal. The word science, it might be said, is to be defined as an empirical and experimental account of the natural world that is restricted both in its subject matter and its conclusions to the natural world. But then the question would be, should Christians engage in science? Or more exactly, in trying to understand the world of nature, should they engage only in science? Shouldn't they instead, or in addition, work out a parallel explanatory activity that takes account of all that we know, including such facts as that human beings were created by the Lord in his image? It is hard to overestimate the dominance and influence of perennial naturalism in our universities. But there is another basic way of looking at the world that is, I think, nearly as influential and just as antithetical to Christianity. Perennial naturalism gets fierce competition from creative anti-realism. So, creative anti-realism. Here, the fundamental idea, in sharp contrast to naturalism, is that we human beings, in some deep and important way, it is we who are responsible for the structure and nature of the world. It is we, fundamentally, who are the architects of the universe. This view received splendid, if obscure, expression in Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Kant did not deny, of course, that there really are such things as mountains, horses, planets, and stars. Instead, his characteristic claim is that their fundamental structures have been conferred upon them by the conceptual activity of persons, not by the conceptual activity of a personal God, but by our conceptual activity, the conceptual activity of human beings. According to this view, the whole phenomenal world, the world of trees and planets and dinosaurs and stars, receives its basic structure from the constituting activity of mind. Such fundamental structures of the world as those of space and time, object and property, number, truth and falsehood, possibility and necessity, these are not to be found in the world as such, but are somehow constituted by our mental or conceptual activity. They are contributions from our side. They do not constitute a grasp of what is to be found in the things in themselves. We impose them on the world. We do not discover them there. Were there no persons like ourselves engaged in conceptual noetic activity, there would be nothing in space and time, nothing displaying object property structure, nothing that is true or false, or possible or impossible, no kinds of things coming in a certain number, nothing like this at all. Now, we might think it impossible that the things we know, houses and trees, horses and cabbages and kings, should exist but fail to be in space-time, or fail to have properties, or fail to display object property structure. Indeed, we may think it impossible that there be a thing of any sort that doesn't have properties. If so, then Kant's view implies that there would be nothing at all if it weren't for the creative structuring activity of persons like us. Of course, I don't say Kant clearly drew this conclusion. Indeed, he may have obscurely drawn the opposite conclusion. That is part of his charm. But the fundamental thrust of Kant's self-styled Copernican revolution is that the things in the world owe their basic structure and perhaps their very existence to the noetic activity of our minds. Or perhaps I should say not minds, but mind. For whether, on Kant's view, there is just one transcendental ego or several is, of course, a vexed question. Indeed, this question is more than vexed. Given Kant's view that quantity, number, is a human category imposed on the world, there is presumably no number, n, finite or infinite, such that the answer to the question, how many of those transcendental egos are there, is n. Until you feel the grip of this way of looking at things, it can seem a bit presumptuous, maybe even preposterous. Did we structure or create the heavens and the earth? Some of us think there were animals, dinosaurs, let's say, roaming the earth before human beings had so much as put in an appearance. How could it be that those dinosaurs owed their structure to our noetic activity? What did we do to give them the structure they enjoyed? And what about all those stars and planets we have never even heard of? There are lots of stars and planets, so we think that we've never heard of. It's not that there are some that we're thinking about some we've never heard of, but rather we think there are some we've never heard of. So how about all them? What did we do to manage, how did we manage to structure them? And when did we do all this? Did we structure ourselves in this way too? And if the way the things are is thus up to us and our structuring activity, why don't we improve things a bit? Perennial naturalism and creative anti-realism are related in an interesting manner. The first vastly underestimates the place of human beings in the universe, and the second vastly overestimates it. According to the first, human beings are essentially no more than complicated machines with no real creativity. In an important sense, we can't really act at all, any more than can a spark plug or a coffee grinder. We are not ourselves the origin of any causal chains. According to the second, by contrast, we human beings, insofar as we confer its basic structure upon the world, really take the place of God. What there is and what it is like is really dependent on us and a result of our activity. Now, section C here, relativism. Okay. In addition to Christianity, so I say, the two basic pictures or perspectives of our time are naturalism and creative anti-realism. But here I must call attention to a complication. First, I say that on these anti-realist views, it is we, the speakers of language, or the users of symbols, or the thinkers of categorizing thoughts, or the makers of basic decisions, who are responsible for the fundamental lineaments of reality. In the words of Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. But sometimes a rather different moral is drawn from the same considerations. Suppose you think our world is somehow created or structured by human beings. You may then note that human beings apparently do not all construct the same worlds. Your Lebenswelt might be quite different from mine. Billy Graham and Richard Rorty don't seem to inhabit the same Lebenswelt, though I'm not sure just what Lebenswelt Richard Rorty inhabits now. Which one, then, if any, represents the world as it really is, that is, as we really have constructed it? Here it is an easy step to another characteristically contemporary thought, the thought that there simply isn't any such thing as the way the world is, no such thing as objective truth or a way the world is that's the same for all of us. Rather, there is my version of reality, the way I've somehow structured things, and your version, how you've structured things, and many other versions. And what is true in one version need not be true in another. Hence the unfortunate locution, true for me, but not true for you. As Marlowe's Dr. Faustus in effect says, man is the measure of all things. I am a man, therefore I am the measure of all things. But then there isn't any such thing as truth simpliciter. There is no single way the world is. There are instead many different versions, perhaps as many different versions as there are persons, and each at bottom is as acceptable as any other. Thus does anti-realism breed relativism. So we have here, as I say, three major perspectives, three wholly different and deeply opposed perspectives: Christian theism, perennial naturalism, and creative anti-realism. But of course, what we also have, as William James said in a different connection, is a blooming, buzzing confusion. The above description is only a zeroth approximation, accurate only within an order or two of magnitude. Much fine-tuning is necessary. Each of these views calls out a sort of opposing reaction to itself. Furthermore, there can very well be a sort of dialectic or development within a given paradigm or way of thinking. And of course, there are channels of influence flowing between them. These three perspectives are total ways of looking at man and the world, can be found in every conceivable and inconceivable sort of combination and mixture. Now, it's unnecessary, I think, to point out that these ways of thinking are not just alternatives to Christianity, they run profoundly counter to it. From a Christian perspective, the naturalist is, of course, deeply mistaken in rejecting or ignoring God. That's bad enough, but in so doing, he also cuts himself off from the possibility of properly understanding ourselves and our world. And as for creative anti-realism, the idea that it is really we human beings who have made or structured the world, from a Christian perspective, is less heroically Promethean than laughably quixotic. And the idea that there is no such thing as truth is no less absurd from a Christian perspective. The application to our present question, what are the essential elements of Christian philosophy, is evident. Philosophy is not neutral with respect to the struggle between these three, Weltanschauungen. Indeed, from one point of view, philosophy just is at bottom an effort to understand the world or ourselves from the vantage point or perspective of one or another of these ways of looking at the world. Philosophy that is clear and deep at any rate, is fundamentally an effort to work out the implications of a worldview, one of these or another, with respect to the sorts of questions philosophers ask and answer. That's what philosophers do, though with varying degrees of self-consciousness and clarity, and very often with a pretense that what they come up with is a deliverance of pure reason. Vast stretches of contemporary philosophy, therefore, will have spiritual or religious roots and spiritual and religious fruits, but these fruits may be unacceptable or even noxious from the perspective of Christian philosophy. And one important job of the Christian philosophical community, therefore, is to discern and understand these fruits, to test the spirits, to evaluate these philosophical constructions and contributions from a Christian point of view. So I say cultural and philosophical criticism is one important aspect of the complete Christian philosopher's job. And in a way, this is utterly obvious. The efforts of some of the most impressive philosophers of our times, the Quines, the Lewises, I'm thinking of the late David Lewis, some of the followers of Wittgenstein, are explicitly directed towards developing a complete, well-rounded, and wholly anti-theistic way of looking at ourselves and the world. Christian philosophers must discern the spiritual connections of the various philosophical and quasi-philosophical currents that swirl around us and make their perceptions known to the rest of the Christian community. This job, I think, isn't being done as well as philosophical theology and apologetics. Of course, the task of criticism extends beyond the boundaries of philosophy. There are many other areas of culture that display the same structure. Consider, for example, the role played by evolutionary theory in our intellectual world. Evolution is a modern idol of the tribe. It is a shibboleth distinguishing the ignorant fundamentalist goats from the informed and scientifically acquiescent sheep. Doubts about it may lose you your job. It is loudly declared to be absolutely certain, certain as the earth rotates on its axis and revolves around the sun. And much of the reason for these exaggerations and for the odium theologicum, I don't know how to pronounce that word. Odium theologicum, is that right? Okay, well, we'll go with it. So the reason for these exaggerations and for that odium aimed at those who presume to disagree comes not from sober consideration of the evidence, but from the religious role evolution plays in contemporary intellectual society. For evolution plays an essential role in naturalistic thought. According to Richard Dawkins, quote, although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Evolution is the only answer anyone can think of to a question that would otherwise be embarrassing and extreme to naturalistic ways of thinking, namely, how did this enormous variety of plant and animal life get here? Naturalism requires an answer to this question. Evolution is the only naturalistic answer anybody has been able to think of, and this is one reason for the quasi-religious status of evolution in contemporary society. Section 4, then, the fourth moment or part of Augustinian Christian philosophy. Positive Christian philosophy. So the first of the two characteristic Augustinian elements of Christian philosophy is cultural criticism, but there is a second like unto it. A fourth crucial element of Christian philosophy is thinking about the sorts of questions philosophers ask and answer from an explicitly Christian point of view. For most of these questions, what's really crucial is theism, the proposition that there is an almighty, all-knowing, holy, good, and loving person who has created the world and created human beings in his image, rather than specifically Christian doctrine. So we could call this fourth element theistic philosophy. Whatever we call it, the project in question is that of thinking about philosophical questions, taking for granted or starting from theism. This isn't just a matter of criticism, of examining contemporary cultural products in philosophy and elsewhere from a Christian perspective, although of course it will no doubt proceed hand in hand with that activity. Here there is a sort of negative-positive structure like that in the case of apologetics. Cultural criticism is negative, or at any rate reactive, but this other project, call it positive Christian philosophy, is instead a matter of thinking about and working out answers to the whole range of questions philosophers ask and answer. For example, how shall we think about so-called abstract objects, such as propositions, states of affairs, sets, properties, possible worlds, and the like? A part of the current lore concerning abstract objects is that they are causally inert, incapable by their very natures of standing in causal relations. One traditional theistic view, however, Augustine's as it happens, is that properties are really divine concepts and propositions divine thoughts. If so, are they really incapable of standing in causal relations? If Augustine is right, they stand to God in the way in which a thought stands to a thinker. This relation involves, among other things, their being produced by the divine thinker. But being produced by seems to be a paradigmatic causal relation. Perhaps it's part of God's very nature to think about and thereby produce these objects, and perhaps God exists necessarily. In that case, abstract objects would be necessary beings that are nevertheless causally dependent upon something else. Speaking of causality, how should we understand it? Is there a kind of necessity involved in causal relations? From a theistic perspective, the paradigm cases of causal relations will involve God's production and conservative activity. He creates us in the world, and he constantly upholds us and the world in being. Here, clearly enough, there is an element of necessity. In every possible world in which God wills that something happen, that thing happens. Every world in which God says, let there be light, is a world in which there is light. So the paradigmatic cases of causality involve necessity, broadly logical necessity. Are there other kinds and cases of causality? Human beings have been created in the image of God. Part of this image in us human beings is our resembling God by way of being able to carry on intentional activity, our ability to envisage and work towards the achievement of goals. But then, of course, there will be some kind of causal connection between our setting out to do a given thing and that thing's happening. This connection will be a connection of a different kind from that between God's willing something and it's taking place. In our case, it's not a necessary truth that if we will P, then P occurs, as it is in the case of God. This connection will be a different one, although it will be set in the context or arena of divine activity. How precisely and in detail does this go? There are, so we are told, natural laws. From a theistic perspective, what sorts of things are these laws? And if indeed there are such things. From one point of view, they constitute a sort of constant backdrop or background or arena for human responsible action. God creates us as creatures capable of action, an action that has a moral dimension. But of course, given the kinds of creatures we are, action requires a certain regularity or constancy or consistency in our world. So one dimension of natural law is that it is there in part to furnish a background or arena for responsible creaturely activity, making it possible for created persons like us to engage in morally significant action. Further, God established these laws, or sets them, or puts them. He's responsible for their presence. How does that go? Could he have established other quite different laws? What sort of necessity do these laws have, if they have any? And where does the regularity or constancy associated with natural laws come from? How is it to be understood? Is it a matter of the regularity of the ways in which God ordinarily treats the creatures he has made? Should we follow Malebranche and Berkeley and Berkeley and think of natural law in a broadly occasionalistic manner? Or shall we follow Aquinas and others and think of natural law as more like the consequence of the natural activity of the kinds of creatures God has made, so that natural law has little by way of ontological priority, but is instead something like a complex vector resultant of the natural activity of God's creatures? How shall we think about knowledge from the perspective of Christian theism? Here, one thing clearly essential is that human beings have been created and created by God. So, in an essential respect, human beings, like the rest of God's creatures, resemble artifacts. They have been designed and fashioned according to a design plan. So they, and their organs and parts, can function properly or improperly. This teleological notion, I think, is deeply embedded in our way of thinking about knowledge, and no doubt this is because theism, Christian and Jewish, has been deeply embedded in our culture for several millennia. A theistic way of thinking about warrant, what distinguishes knowledge from mere true belief, will take advantage of this fact of creation and the teleology it brings with it. A theistic understanding of warrant, so I say, will draw heavily upon the notion of proper function. But how should we think about that notion? At present, there is a flourishing cottage industry devoted to giving naturalistic analyses or explanations of the notion of function, proper function, purpose, and the like, as they apply to human beings and other organisms. These typically proceed in terms of evolution, and as far as I can see, none of them work out. A related area of crucial importance at the moment is the philosophy of mind. How shall we think about what it is to have or be a mind? What is it to be capable of intentional activity? How shall we understand this power we have to select an object for attention and predicate properties of it? We can think about the moon, for example, or about the number 7, or the property of being a horse. The object need not be present. Indeed, it need not be either concrete indeed, what I've got here is it need not be either concrete, oh yeah, okay, that's right. It need not be either concrete or material. I thought it said it need not be either concrete or immaterial, and then I was wondering what the other option was. But the object need not be present, it need not be a concrete object, so how does this work? Contemporary philosophy of mind, interesting and vigorous as much of it is, will be of little help here. For the most interesting and vigorous projects in this area are part of an enterprise devoted to the attempt to understand mind and personhood naturalistically. This puts such severe constraints on the project that little of real interest is likely to emerge. Indeed, a large cadre of those engaged in the project finally denied that there really is any such thing as intentionality or even belief, relegating these and other notions of, quote, folk psychology, unquote, to the trash heap of outgrown superstitions. A theist may be able to learn a good bit from this, but fundamentally she will ask different questions and look for answers in quite different directions. These are just a few of the topics to think about from a theistic perspective, and of course there are many others. Probability, for example, or subjunctive conditionals, the development of science, the nature of freedom, the nature of human action, the nature of language. From a naturalistic point of view, even if you think there are such things as properties and propositions, it isn't at all easy to see how elements of our language could come to express them. A question of quite a different nature, how should we think about duty on the one hand and human flourishing on the other in connection with God? And how are duty and human flourishing related to each other? How should we think about love in all its manifestations, about our sense of beauty, or to take a vastly underdeveloped topic, our sense of play and humor? These and many other questions await penetrating and detailed investigation by Christian philosophers. In some instances, it is important to the intellectual and spiritual health of the Christian community to clearly understand the topic in question. The whole area of the relation of science to religion would be an example. Now the last section, section 5, an objection. I say Christian philosophers should address these questions and topics starting from the Christian faith, using all that they know, including Christian teachings. But here we encounter an important objection. To get a grasp of this objection, we must first make a brief detour. According to historic Christianity, there are two broad sources of knowledge or true belief. First, there is reason, construed broadly, so that it encompasses not just a priori knowledge, but also perceptual knowledge, as well as what one learns by way of memory and induction, reads, sympathy, and the like. For us to learn what we do learn by way of these sources, God do nothing special, just the usual conservation of his creation, together perhaps with concurrence in creaturely activity. But there's another source of knowledge or true belief, according to Christians, faith, together with its object or correlative, divine revelation. It is by way of the first sort of knowledge that we know the size of the earth, the distance to the moon, and that human beings die. By way of the second, however, we learn of God's plan for the redemption of humankind through the life and death and resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ. To return to the objection, the objector claims that if, as a scholar, say a philosopher, you start from what you know by way of faith, if you employ as a premise in your arguments propositions that you know by faith rather than by way of reason, then your results will really be theology rather than philosophy or psychology or sociology or whatever. If you start from theological convictions in a given area, an understanding of love or humor or aggression or knowledge or abstract objects, then any conclusion you come to will be dependent upon theological convictions and will themselves therefore be theology. Theology in, theology out, as the computer literati say. And while a theological understanding of these phenomena may be important and desirable, it's still theology. It isn't philosophy or psychology or sociology or whatever. To keep to have the latter, we must keep ourselves pure and unspotted from theology. This is a common view, and it is or has been something like a semi-official position of many Roman Catholic thinkers. But here we must note that there are two quite different Christian traditions on this point. Call them the Augustinian and Thomist traditions. According to the latter, there is theology, and there are also the other sciences. The non-theological sciences are the province of reason. They contain what we can know by natural reason, unaided by faith or special revelation. They concern general revelation as opposed to special revelation. And in pursuing them, it is illegitimate to appeal to theology or to what one knows by way of faith. Of course, the reason isn't that we don't need to know what we know by faith. Theology is both important and necessary, and perhaps more noble than its sister disciplines. But we do also need the non-theological disciplines. According to the Augustinian tradition, by contrast, what we need and want in studying a given area is the best total understanding we can get, using all the resources at our command. The question whether that best understanding should be called theology, on the one hand, or philosophy, or sociology, or psychology, on the other hand, is of secondary interest. Well, why does the Thomist think it's important to have a philosophy or a psychology that's unspotted by theology? What is the value of such science, and why should we expend a portion of our intellectual resources on it? The Thomist will answer that what we know by way of reason has for us an epistemic or epistemological or cognitive advantage over what we know by way of faith. What we grasp by faith, we know by way of testimony. We take it on the authority of someone else. If that someone else is God, then indeed the belief in question is backed up by high authority indeed. Objectively speaking, furthermore, we might say it's maximally certain. Still, we don't really know what we take on trust, what we take someone else's word for, even if that someone else is God himself. Or if we can say that we do know it, we don't have the highest and best form of knowledge of it. We don't have scientia. Consider, for example, the Pythagorean theorem, or the proposition that there is no set of all sets, or Gödel's theorem on the incompleteness of arithmetic, and consider two ways of believing it, believing any of them. In the first way, you believe it on the authority of your favorite mathematician, whom you know to be authoritative on this topic. Then compare believing it in that way by grasping, understanding the proof, and seeing for yourself that the theorem is not only true, but couldn't possibly be false. It makes good sense to say with a Thomist that in the second case, the knowledge you have of that truth is better, more valuable, a higher kind of knowledge than in the first case. It is more like God's knowledge. God, after all, never has to take anybody's word for anything. This reply has a certain sort of appeal, but I think the appeal is limited. For in most of the sciences, and certainly in philosophy, we don't at all have the sort of knowledge we have of the Pythagorean theorem or the fundamental theorem of the calculus. We don't have anything at all like the sort of certainty we have in elementary logic and mathematics. My sympathies, therefore, lie with the Augustinian view. I am at best suspicious of the epistemic benefits claimed on behalf of philosophy or science untainted by theology. But perhaps there is less separation here than meets the eye, or perhaps we can reduce the separation. I wish to make an irenic proposal. Think again about these theoretical or interpretative sciences, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, and so on. The best way to do these sciences, says the Augustinian, is to use all that we know, including what we know by way of faith or revelation. According to the Thomists, the way to proceed is to bracket what we know by faith and appeal only to premises we know by reason. But Thomist and Augustinian agree that the Christian community badly needs that fuller understanding of these phenomena. So suppose we think of the matter as follows. There are the deliverances of faith, call them F. There is also the result of thinking about a given philosophical question or a question in one of the sciences, appealing to the deliverances of faith as well as to the deliverances of reason, call that FS. Thomist and Augustinian concur that we need FS. But the Thomist adds that FS is really theology rather than philosophy or sociology or whatever. But now consider that conditional, if F, then FS, the proposition that says what the implications of the faith are for the particular philosophical or scientific question at issue. Of course, there will be a very large number of such propositions, and there will also be one gigantic super proposition here, whose antecedent will be the conjunction of all the elements of the faith relevant to any philosophical or theological question, and whose consequent will be the conjunction of the consequence of the more particular propositions of this form. Now, both parties to the discussion, both Thomist and Augustinian, agree that these bridge propositions, as we might call them, ones of the form if F, then Fs, are not themselves among the deliverances of faith. We discover and learn them by reason, not by faith. We discover and learn them by seeing what the bearing of the faith is on the particular question. It is by reason rather than faith that we see what the bearing of the Christian faith is on psychology or some particular question in psychology. It is by reason rather than faith that we see how theism bears on ontology and how the Christian teaching of the Imago Dei bears on epistemology or the philosophy of mind. So both sides agree, indeed insist, that we, the Christian community, need to know how faith bears on these areas. And both agree that working at these conditionals is a matter not of faith and theology, but of reason and philosophy or the relevant science. Further, both agree that Christians will assert the consequence of these conditions. Christians will assert the consequence of these conditionals. That is, we will assert the result of seeing how faith applies to the domain in question. The two sides differ only in this. According to the Thomist, but not the Augustinian, when you assert the consequent of such a conditional, you are really doing theology rather than philosophy or the science in question. Well, here's my ironic proposal. Why shouldn't the Augustinian peaceably concede the point, at least for present purposes? Perhaps it doesn't matter greatly whether we say that asserting these consequences is theology on the one hand, or philosophy, psychology, or economics, or whatever on the other. What is of great importance at present is that we work at discovering and developing our knowledge of the conditionals. And working at these conditionals is not doing theology. It clearly falls within the domain of the non-theological disciplines involved. It is not the theologian who is most appropriately trained and qualified for work on those conditionals. It is instead the psychologist, historian, biologist, economist, philosopher, or whatever. Here, Augustinian and Thomist can agree. They can agree on the importance of this work for the spiritual and intellectual health of the Christian community, and they can agree that it is working at these conditionals that in doing that, we are doing non-theological science rather than theology. By way of conclusion, therefore, Christian philosophy, so I say, has at least these four major parts or moments or aspects: philosophical theology, apologetics, both positive and negative, Christian philosophical criticism, and positive Christian philosophy. Of course, all sorts of important questions remain. For just one example, how should we think of those conditionals I was just mentioning? Presumably they aren't entailments, but then what is the connection between antecedent and consequent? Or if they are entailments, what goes into the antecedent in addition to the relevant elements apprehended by faith? Furthermore, Christians disagree with one another to one degree or another as to precisely what the Christian faith is, precisely what is to count as the deliverance of the faith. How does that bear on the question, what goes into the antecedent of one of these conditionals? These and 1,000 other questions remain. Perhaps the most important thing, however, is to work at the conditionals, and we needn't answer these questions before starting the work. Thank you.